Warwick Sabin, as I mentioned, is the publisher of Oxford American. In 2009, he was named one of the 40 most influential people in the national magazine industry. He's previously worked at Capitol Hill, he's worked at the White House, he's worked for Foreign Affairs magazine. He's a Marshall Scholar, a Truman Scholar, and he holds an MA in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from the Oxford University. And this is what I like to think of as the real Oxford University, the one in England. And he has a BA in Political Science from the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Let me say a word about the Oxford American, for those of you that maybe are not as familiar with it as you probably should be. Frank Thurman, and I want to thank Frank, by the way, for helping, where is Frank, to set this up. Frank served as the intermediary early on and was extremely helpful. Frank let me borrow his copy of the Oxford American. This is, I believe, the most recent edition of it. It's their very famous and well-done music edition, and this one is focusing on music in Alabama. The Oxford American has been published since 1992. It is billed as the Southern Magazine of Good Writing. It's won 2 national magazine awards. It's featured the original work of such very well-known, nationally known writers as Charles Portis, Roy Blunt Jr., Donald Harrington, Donna Tartt, Ernest Gaines, and many, many others. The magazine has also published previously unseen work by William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, Walker Percy, James Agee, Zora Neale Hurston, James Dickey, and Carson McCullers, which is an extremely impressive group of writers there. The magazine is also noted for its impressive art and photography and has released 2 DVDs. It's also received wide acclaim for its annual Southern Music issue, which includes a CD of songs highlighting a variety of genres and eras. Perhaps the ultimate compliment comes from the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times newspaper, which refer to the Oxford American as perhaps the liveliest literary magazine in America. Warwick Sabin's talk is on magazine survival in the new media landscape. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Warwick.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Dr. Phil Potts, and thanks for this invitation. I'd like to thank, of course, UALR and Amy Burns in particular, and my friend Frank Thurman for arranging this talk. And I know many of you are probably English or journalism or communications majors. Am I right about that? Okay, well, you're stuck with me talking about the business of magazine publishing. So I want to let you know that, I came into this kind of from your perspective. I had always been on the editorial side of journalism, whether it was at Foreign Affairs magazine or at the Arkansas Times or in any of the other journalistic endeavors I'd ever been involved with. I like to write, and I still do a piece in the magazine every issue. This position of publisher fell into my lap a few years ago when the magazine underwent some serious business problems, and they were kind of stuck with me to try to fix them. And so since then, I've learned a lot about the business of magazine publishing, and I think it's a pretty fascinating subject. At least I've come to realize it. It's extremely challenging. Obviously, the whole landscape of print media is evolving very quickly, as I know you all are very aware of. And so, I'm kind of glad to kind of walk you through it, basically, from my perspective, as I've learned it over the last couple of years. I'm going to try to highlight most of the main issues, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions, and I want you all to bother me about it. But I think the main point I want to kind of lay out on the front end for all of you all is that, even if you are only interested in content and writing or contributing in some way, because obviously now magazines exist not only in print, but in virtual reality, which includes music and video and everything else. So if you want to be a content creator, I guess as we all are being referred to these days, you should be interested in the business, because it's tough to make your living as a writer or as a content producer. And more the trend seems to be toward people wanting to have content and not paying for it, which is a serious trend that's affecting everybody, newspapers, magazines, everyone else. And so we all need to be aware of the business and how it works. And so I'm going to try to kind of sketch that out for you, and we'll talk about it. But really quickly, I want to intro also by just mentioning, the Oxford American. I think Dr. Phil Potts gave you a pretty good history of it. so I don't need to go too much into detail except to say that the OA is a very unique publication. I mean, it's not like a lot of the other publications you see on the newsstand in the sense that it's not published by a big conglomerate. Most magazines these days are. It occupies a very unique niche in that it focuses on Southern culture, which there are very few publications that do that in the way we do that. And for that reason, the OA is in a very good position and in a very bad position. Kind of being different, as we all know, can have its advantages and its disadvantages. I'm going to try to work my way through the speech to the end result that it's an advantage for us. Maybe wishful thinking, but I'll lay out my argument anyway, so we'll talk about that. But when it comes to magazine publishing, I think it's important for everybody to obviously understand that there are basically two pillars it stands on. It's those two revenue sources, advertising and circulation. And obviously advertising are all the ads you see in the magazine. Circulation is how it gets distributed. Obviously you want more of both. You want as many ads as you can get, and you want as many people reading your publication as possible. And obviously the two things support each other. So what happens in the magazine industry and in newspapers is that when you've got a lot of advertising, you've got a lot of readers, and they're working in conjunction with each other, things are going really well. But when one starts to slip, it can grab the other one, and it can take your publication into a death spiral very quickly. And I think that's what we've been seeing, obviously, in all of print media, basically for the last 10 years. Advertising and circulation can be like two drowning people handcuffed to each other in the middle of the ocean. It makes it impossible for either to swim, and you both slowly drown. And that's what we're trying to kind of avoid doing, obviously at the Oxford American and in other places. But I think the issue, when we start talking about how those two things work in tandem, I mean, obviously when your circulation is high, you can charge more for advertising. The problem sometimes, though, with having a really high circulation is that it's really expensive to maintain it. And so I know these are kind of obvious points, but they're tripping up some of the most prestigious names in the industry, so I think it's important for us to acknowledge them and talk about them. You want your circ, like I said, to be high because you can charge more for your ads, but when you're printing more magazines, especially a magazine like this, it's very expensive to print it. It's very expensive to distribute it, to ship it, to mail it. But yet what tends to happen in the magazine industry is that once you've had a high circ and you are charging those high ad rates, even if your subscriber base begins to slip a little bit, you still end up trying to maintain the same circulation, even sometimes by mailing out issues for free, because there are two things working. There's the pride involved, where if you're used to going to advertisers all the time and saying, we have 200,000 people who read our magazine, you don't want to go back to them the next year and say, well, actually, now we only have 150 or 100. It makes it seem like you're losing ground and you're slipping. And so I think there's a lot of pride involved there. Obviously, at the same time, if you do lose circulation and your advertisers say, well, I don't want to pay as much for the ads that I have been paying, then all of a sudden you're losing revenue in two different areas. You've lost, obviously, the subscribers and the newsstand sales and the circ side, but now all of a sudden you have to charge less for an ad, and so your revenue's going down on both sides, and it can feel really bad. So what you tend to see happening is, like I said, I mean, people try to maintain what's called an artificial circulation rate, where people actually aren't paying to read it, but you're mailing it for free to doctors' offices, to dentists' offices. Sometimes if you maintain a certain net worth, people will mail you magazines for free. And it's sort of that old, situation where it seems like the people who have the most money get the most for free. Well, if you're making over $250,000 a year, you're probably receiving a lot of magazines in your mailbox for free, and if you don't know why, well, now you know. Not that I assume there are a lot of people in this room making that much money, but it's because these magazines want to tell their advertisers, hey, we're being read by people who make over $250,000 a year. They're not saying that these people aren't paying for it. They're just saying, that that's what's going on. And so what you have happening, it's kind of like what's going on in the national economy with our government or anything else. You have these sort of artificially inflated numbers, and you have too much pride to admit, that things aren't going the way you do. And so they're spending all the money to print and mail, they're getting less revenue for doing so, and they go into debt. And you may have read about, Newsweek magazine, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second, but Newsweek had been going for years, losing millions and millions of dollars and just being floated by their investors because in my estimation, in my opinion, there was a lot of pride involved. This was a prestigious title that was, had a great history in the United States, and people didn't want to admit that it was slipping. But there are a lot of good reasons why Newsweek was slipping. And then, you have the situation that Newsweek was left in, which, like I said, I'm going to return to in a second. But so there you have sort of the basic economics of the magazine industry, very simply stated. Now, obviously, the thing I haven't mentioned yet, but obviously is impacting what's going on in the last 10 years, is the introduction of the internet. And most people in this room, probably have had the internet, ever since you started reading. But there's still some of us who remember the days before you could get magazine or newspaper content on the internet. And the situation with the internet, in a nutshell, as you know, is that there's a plethora of information available, and most of it is available for free. And even if the information wasn't intended to be available for free in the first place, it ends up for free because, as you know, whether it was music, whether it's movies, whether it's newspaper or magazine content, even if the plan was to charge for it, all somebody has to do is scan something or type it in and upload it, and it's on the internet for free. The New York Times a long time ago tried to charge for its op-ed content and things like that. And it didn't work because people who were paying for it would take the content and then put it up on their own website for free, and it was, people could get it that way. We're all used to getting information for free on the internet, and there's a lot of it. And so, it seems like recently, all of a sudden, the newspapers and the magazines, which went onto the internet 10 years ago and putting most of their content up for free, have all of a sudden decided, whoa, maybe that was a bad idea. Maybe now we want to charge for it. But it's almost like it's too late. That ship has left, and people are used to getting information for free on the internet, and I don't think they want to pay for it. And unless some really amazing technology happens, and maybe somebody's out there inventing it right now, but unless that happens, where you can really create content that is protected and that nobody can take and then just repost and make available for free, you can't expect to be able to really make a lot of money that way. Also, in the magazine business, we all have websites, or we all try to at least, make some kind of money. We all have to be on the internet to some degree, but you can't charge as much for an ad on the internet. Even if you can say that you're getting 1 million page views a day, the ad rate for a space on the internet is just never going to be what it is in print. People are not willing to pay the same amount. And there's a lot of philosophical reasons and business reasons, and a lot of people have done research about that. But it's just, at this point, unavoidable that nobody will pay the same amount for an ad on the internet as in print. So think about it. You're running a publication. That's a kind of a tough thing because you got to be on the web, and people are expecting it, and you're kind of trying to drive traffic there, but you can't realize that revenue because you can't charge for the content and you can't get the same amount of money for the ads. So it creates a huge economic problem that we're dealing with right now. And as far as the internet goes, for magazines in particular, there are also a couple of other challenges, and these specifically regard content. So again, this is starting to get closer to maybe what you're interested in. Number one, with a magazine, you have to print it, you have to ship it, right? So there's always going to be a bit of a delay between when you write something and when it arrives in front of a reader. That's obvious, but economically speaking, it's a problem because when you're a magazine, again, like Newsweek, and you are supposedly trying to be very current and giving people the news and analysis they want on a weekly basis, how you're competing with a technology like the internet where people can get that right away. Why would anybody want to wait a few days for this thing to come when by the time it gets there, it's pretty much old news, literally. And so that's obviously just the instantaneous nature of the information. It's challenging for magazines that are trying to be really current. Not so much for us, and again, I'll get to that, but but for those kind of magazines. Second of all, a lot of magazines, are focused on long-form journalism, more than just, a short news story. But do you want me to refresh this? We're focused on long-form journalism, and we all know on the internet most people don't like to read long pieces. I mean, the most research, and I think all of us anecdotally know that it's difficult to read a really long essay on the internet. So, when it comes to magazines that focus on that, there's obviously a challenge with trying to utilize the internet for that reason. And so ultimately, what you see happening in the magazine industry in particular is you have the impact of the internet. You have, in general, readership of anything declining. People read less in terms of books, magazines, other kinds of publications, because people are getting it more through other kinds of media. And so the way magazines are trying to position themselves these days is that they're becoming brands. If any of you are in marketing or business or any kind of thing like that, the one thing magazines can do is establish themselves as an authority on a subject. So if you're Sports Illustrated, you're the authority on sports. If you're Vogue, you're the authority on fashion. Your brand becomes more important almost than the initial reason for you existing, which was to publish a magazine. And people try to wrap things into that brand, whether it's their website or whether it's an app on their iPhone or their iPad or anything else. They're trying to own that space, whether or not ultimately the content has anything to do with what, again, originally appeared in the magazine. So you see magazines heading that direction. And there's one way in which this is an advantage for magazines if they have established brands, which is that, again, with the internet having so much information available to all of us, sometimes it's really hard to sort through information that's valuable versus information that's not or reliable. When you have a strong brand, people are going to trust you and trust your information. And so if you can actually direct people to your website or to your app because you are that authority on sports or music or fashion, you have an advantage. And again, you may become something very different than what you originally set out to be. Sports Illustrated may end up just being, a running tally of, sports scores along with some analysis, which is very different than, the weekly magazine. It's been for, 80 years. But that may be where it ends up, because that's where the magazine industry is going, and that's where the economics of it is driving it. Again, talking about Newsweek, just because it's such a relevant example, Newsweek, great brand, right? Everybody's heard of Newsweek, and it's something that everybody in America used to read. It used to be the magazine that everybody subscribed to, Time, Newsweek, etc. But again, the internet comes along, and Newsweek seems dated. Why would you want week-old news? Just the name itself, it sort of seems boring and irrelevant. And so people stop subscribing, and the whole readership habits of America change. And all of a sudden, it's millions of dollars in debt. Now, as you may know, Newsweek was sold for $1 a few months ago to a guy named Sidney Harmon. And he bought it for its brand, basically. And recently, it merged with a website called The Daily Beast. The Daily Beast is basically, a solely internet creation, which is again meant to be one of these instant news and analysis type websites. And the idea by merging them is that the Daily Beast is hip and relevant. Newsweek's got this strong brand. We're going to bring them together and make it work. And we'll see what happens with that. I don't know how it's going to go. I do know that the Daily Beast was losing millions of dollars a year. I know that Newsweek was losing millions of dollars a year. So putting them together, they're either going to both lose even more money together, or maybe they'll figure out how to make money. Another relevant example to compare to, although we're not talking about magazine in particular in this example, is the recent acquisition of the Huffington Post by AOL. And if you all have been keeping track of this, and again, this is going to go to the heart of what you all may be interested in doing with your lives, but Huffington Post is this, it's only 5 years old, basically. I guess a little bit older, about 6 years old. But you know, the Huffington Post is this kind of crazy amalgamation of news and blogs and gossip and entertainment stuff. It's just all kind of mishmash there. But it gets a lot of eyes because you know there's so much on there that there's usually somebody gets driven there for one reason or another because one of their interests is going to be represented. The interesting thing about the Huffington Post, though, is that they don't pay anybody to write for them. They give people blog space, and you know a lot of those people are famous people or influential people, but you know it's an interesting business model because basically you have all the content creation happening by a group of people who aren't making any money, and then you know Ariana Huffington, who started the website and gets all this stuff for free, just made $300 and something million. AOL, even before they acquired Huffington Post, had a news sort of, I would call it, I mean, they're trying to be like a news reporting site. I'd call it more of a news aggregation site, but they were trying to create these small local websites all over the country that reported local news. And that way, it would be a way of driving people again to the AOL pages in those areas. But again, they weren't really paying their writers, or if they were paying an editor a minimal amount of money to kind of bring in all this news. The other thing that AOL was doing was that they were developing, and still are, a news reporting system that writes its news articles in such a way to make them search engine optimized, which many of you may know what that means, but it's basically like putting enough of certain kinds of words into the story so that when people type in those words to the search engine, this news story will be what they get. And again, the reason why they do that is because they're trying to drive as much traffic there so they can charge more to their advertisers, because they can say we have this many page views at this website. But the kind of news that creates is unintelligible. I mean, there's no quality control. There's no effort to create a really interesting or well-written or well-constructed news article. What you have is a bunch of words strung together, literally. It's almost sort of a travesty if you care anything about writing whatsoever, but it's driven completely, again, by the economics of it. I mean, in a way, it's like almost like an Orwellian thing. Like George Orwell would have come up with this as a way of ridiculing our society, because people reading articles that don't make any sense, and they're just a bunch of jarbled up words scrambled together, put together in order that people will read them, and people are reading them because they're driven there like sheep, just kind of like herded into this thing and sent to this place, and they don't care, I guess, whether the article is good or bad. That's the AOL strategy. These are the people who just bought the Huffington Post, and this could be, again, the direction that publishing is going, or at the very least, this is what we have to compete with. And we're, call ourselves the Southern Magazine of good writing. So yes, we care about the quality of the writing we do. And if economically we lose out to writing that is, a failure on every level, I think that's a sad commentary on our society, put it bluntly. However, there's still some other, positive trends or interesting trends in the print media, or I guess I can't even call it the print media industry, since I'm about to talk about, digital readers, basically. I mean, we all know about the Kindle, the Nook that Barnes & Noble has introduced, and of course the iPad is the most famous one. But these are interesting and could be very helpful in certain ways, because when you have a digital reader, it's a little bit different than the internet, because you're not, competing with people who are scanning, across multiple web pages. They're actually choosing your publication and downloading it and reading it, and in those cases also paying for it, or in most cases, I should say. They're actually, I mean, I'm sure you've all used these readers. You have to pick something, you have to download it, and you actually have it in a place where you can read it. And it obviously makes it easy to access. I mean, you're not having to mail or distribute a magazine. You're not having to hope that somebody sees it on a Barnes & Noble newsstand, of 500 titles. You can charge a lower price for it because, you're not, again, having to print and mail it, so you can charge a lower price. It's cheaper for us to distribute it. The other thing is you have a smaller audience, but a more dedicated audience. I mean, people who are actually interested in reading. Also demographically, and this is good or bad, but if you can afford to buy a reader, that means you probably have more disposable income. It means you probably have higher net worth. And it means that, as far as a magazine like us is concerned, you're more likely to be a reader of our magazine. Because quite frankly, people who read magazines, especially at the higher end or the literary end, they're better educated, and therefore they usually make more money a year and things like that. That's just, again, the economics of the situation. But for those reasons, the readers can prove helpful. I should say one other thing, the readers actually help you present your magazine, at least in the case of magazines, in a format that's closest to what you originally intended. Because when we try to put magazine content on the internet, it's almost impossible to replicate that experience unless we posted a bunch of PDFs on the internet. But that's not the way most people want to read on the internet. You want to have it in a HTML format. And so what you end up getting is kind of like the difference between reading the New York Times in print or on the internet, which is more of like a plain text kind of format. And that's what we have to do with our articles. But with readers, they actually utilize either XML or PDF technology. So when you read this on the Kindle or the Nook or on your iPad or whatever, it looks just like this. And it also includes the advertising, which is great for us because we can tell our advertisers it's in a lot of different places. The disadvantages, though, to this, is that, in the case of the Apple Store, I don't know if you've read about this, but Apple is very proprietary about anything that goes across its devices, whether it's the iPhone or their iPad. So the magazine industry, which originally was really excited about the iPad, is now really, really, really angry at Apple because Apple wants, I think 70% of the cost of a single issue or subscription. They also want all the sales to go through the Apple Store, so you can't send somebody to your website to buy something. If they've gotten it through the app, you actually they have to continue to make any purchase through the app, which means, again, the 70% cut for Apple. Also, Apple wants to own the information about the readers and the subscribers. So, if it was in print, I would know that you bought this. I would know your address, your phone number, your email address. If you provided it, I'd be able to market to you and ask you to renew and do other things. But Apple wants to own that. They want to have that information. And publishers are really, really upset about that. So right now, Apple's kind of on everybody's bad list, and Google, has just introduced last week something called OnePass, which I think is they're mean to compete with the iPad and make publishers' content available directly through the publisher. I think they're only taking, a much smaller percentage, maybe only 10% of whatever sales. So, there's going to be a lot of shaking out of this economic situation when it comes to kind of being on readers and making that available. The only other problem also with readers is that you cannibalize your print readers. If somebody decides, they really like getting this on their iPad or on their Nook or their Kindle, then they might stop subscribing to your print edition. And you get more money, and you get, you also still have to tell your advertisers what your circ is. And they might like the fact that you're on the Nook, but they still want to see what your print circ is. And so publishers right now are really caught in a catch-22 because you want to be in all these places, but you also don't want to cannibalize this while people still value this more than the other stuff. It's a very complicated and tricky tightrope for publishers to walk. As far as the publishing industry goes too, when we're kind of considering all this, as I mentioned before, most magazines are owned by big conglomerates, big companies. I'm sure you've heard of Condé Nast, which publishes a lot of titles that you all have heard of, like The New Yorker and Vanity Fair and Vogue and Wired. There's Hearst, which publishes Esquire and a bunch of those other big publications. There's Hachette. And so what happens is with the magazine industry is you've got a lot of overhead. You've got a lot of high salaries because all these people are in big fancy office buildings in New York City, almost invariably. There's a lot of marketing that goes on. A company like Time Inc., for instance, which publishes tons and tons of magazine titles, their budget is huge when it comes to marketing. So a lot of these magazines across the board are all losing money, but it's hard to tell whether they're losing money because they're losing readers and can't quite make the economics work just strictly on the basis of all the factors that go into a magazine, paying writers, printing, circulation, or whether they're losing money because there's just so much of this extra stuff going on. And you have to wonder, when it comes to print media, when people really talk about how bad things are, the death knell, have they really, really tried to, focus on their core mission of publishing, or have they gotten so caught up, in this other stuff that really, is very tangential to magazine publishing that maybe we're not getting a really good look on whether the economics work. And that's, again, when it comes to the Oxford American, we know what it costs to publish a magazine and to pay writers and do all that, and we don't have that kind of overhead. And I think that may be a model going forward for other magazines, whether, I don't know if you're ever going to peel away some of these big corporations, but again, not to put, too broad a brush on it, but, a lot of what we've seen in America the last couple decades is all this, merging and conglomeration, which doesn't always work. And sometimes it's better to separate out and become more efficient and more pared down as far as, what your core mission of your company is. One thing about the magazine business is that there are still a lot of people reading magazines, and there are a lot of really good reasons why people continue to read magazines. I mean, the kind of content that you get in a magazine, if it's not that instantaneous news that I was talking about, it's unique to magazines because, books are one thing and newspapers are another thing, but there's a certain type of journalism or a certain type of literary writing that really has its place in a magazine. And as far as magazines go, as we understand the word, the future of it may still be in print. I mean, despite all the technology that's available and everything that we're going in, there's a reason why this still has value to people who want to read the kind of content that's here. There's a reason why when you walk into Barnes & Noble, there are hundreds of magazines along, those walls that you see there. There's a experience that's involved with a magazine. Some of it is tactile, some of it's the paper, some of it's the presentation, how it looks, some of it's the portability, you can roll it up, you can take it to the beach, there's just, you can throw a magazine anywhere. And like I said, I mean, as far as the kind of writing that's in it, sometimes there are just pieces that you want to take your time with. You want to read a newspaper pretty much that day because you're going to get another one the next day. With a book, obviously you're going to take your time with that, but with this, there are different, articles of different lengths, and you can hold on to it, and I think that, it's kind of hard to do that when you're going back and forth with any kind of, digital experience. This still has value. Also, the way it's delivered, I mean, obviously you get it at your doorstep or you pick it up in a store. There's just a certain reason why this has value. What you may see happening, however, when it comes to magazines is, as I mentioned before, you're probably going to end up with a smaller and more elite audience. As I mentioned, I mean, just people are reading less these days anyway. And magazines are going to become more and more expensive to produce. I mean, the cost of paper keeps going up. We know the cost of fuel keeps going up, which means, delivering them is going to get more and more expensive. So you're going to be left with people who are willing to pay more, basically, to get the magazine. But again, that may be okay because the people who are reading these days kind of fit that demographic anyway. They're people who are willing to pay a little bit more for a meal, for an experience, go to the theater, go to the symphony. I mean, this is kind of the way American culture is going, where the elites, for lack of a better word, are kind of peeling off, and these experiences are being reserved for them, for better or worse, and that may be where the magazine industry goes. But I think that, again, you're going to end up with magazines that are more specialized, with these smaller companies. I mean, the days of this mass market. I mean, I want to go back to the idea that, when magazines were being published in the first half of the 20th century, there was a democratizing experience that was taking place, and also a unifying experience that was taking place, because sort of whether you were very highly educated or not that educated, everybody kind of had access to the Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, Time, Newsweek, and those magazines also made an effort to cover the broad spectrum of our society, whether it was sports, But Life magazine would have like a profile of the college football quarterback that had won the Rose Bowl, and then you turn the page and there would be a profile of Leonard Bernstein, the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. And it was a way of, like I said, democratizing the experience. This was a culture that had just served together in World War II across multiple racial, economic, religious, every kind of lines. And it brought America together in these experiences, like I said. So what we've seen since then, however, is the sort of specialization or balkanization of American culture, where everybody kind of crawls back into whatever they feel comfortable with, whether it's their own political opinions, their own particular interests or hobbies. That's kind of that's kind of the community we've created on the internet and everything else. So that's sort of what you're going to see magazines do, is probably peel off into really kind of focused subjects, and that's what's already happened. But you're going to lose also those broader experiences like the Newsweek experiences. You're going to lose news in general. I don't think you're going to see news in magazines because, again, for all the reasons that we mentioned, things are getting more and more quick. So what you're going to see is more literature, more analysis. Magazines like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, specialized analysis on particular issues. Magazines about design, architecture, interior design, fashion, as I mentioned. Magazines focused on particular aspects of technology or economics. And on that point, one of the magazines that's doing the best these days right now is The Economist. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But again, it's all those things that we've talked about. It's a reliable brand that appeals to an elite audience, that covers a particular subject and provides analysis, and it's those kind of publications that I think are going to survive going forward. So if I can kind of start heading towards the summation, when it comes to the Oxford American and the way I see where we are, I kind of like where we are based on how I've kind of sketched out the argument. The magazine has had a lot of economic problems in its past. And it's had a lot of challenges in the past, specifically because it had a really unique niche, which meant it had a smaller, more elite audience and didn't have those high circ and couldn't charge as much for ads and all those things that I've said used to drive the magazine industry. But now, as we know, those things are actually turning into advantages. We own and occupy a space, Southern culture and great Southern writing that we alone rule. And it's our brand that's strong and stands for that. We put a premium on our design. Every issue of the Oxford American has what you would call coffee table value or bookshelf value. People don't want to throw it away when they finish it. They want to display it on their coffee table. Maybe their friends, think that they're smart and read a lot if they see them on the coffee table. We have a photography, design, those kinds of experiential things, the paper even. And again, that's going to become more and more of an advantage, I think, in this new economic climate. Again, I mentioned the quality of the writing. People have a lot of choices when it comes to what they want to read. They're going to want to pick up stuff, if they're actually going to spend money on it, that's good and not a bunch of words strung together to please a search engine. We have a smaller circulation, but we have better demographics, higher educated, high net worth individuals. It's a format that's easily translated to digital readers. So, we're going to look good on the Nook or the Kindle or any of those other, the iPad, everything else. And finally, one thing that we're doing in addition to all of this other stuff is we're trying to build a community of readers. We're trying to do those things that, supposedly the internet does, but we're trying to do it in a real way, because we know that when people make a choice to subscribe to a magazine or even to purchase it, they're making a statement about themselves and what they value. And so in this case, they value good writing, Southern culture, and they also want to experience that. They want to connect to the brand. So we're trying to do more in the events realm. We're going all over the South and all over the country, and we're doing music events and events around Southern food and events around Southern writers, and going into people's communities and inviting them, using our subscriber lists and our donor lists, and trying to get them to connect to who we are and what we do and feel that, because the more they feel connected to the brand and the more they have that kind of experience, the more likely they are to continue their subscription, to continue reading it. And so it's, in a way, it's kind of an old school idea, which is, invite somebody to join you in person for something, instead of just interacting with you digitally. But at the same time, it's not old school because magazines didn't used to have to do that. Now I feel like we do. And so building community and events is important. But at the same time, the OA strategy is to be available in print, to be available on all of these digital readers, to be on the internet. We're doing video, a whole new video series up there called So Lost. You can kind of see it there at the bottom. And we inaugurated this video series in 2009, and after only 6 months, we were among 5 finalists for a National Magazine Award in the video category. We were competing, and the 5 finalists were us, National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, ESPN, the magazine, companies with much bigger budgets. But our videos were very high quality, produced by a guy here in Little Rock named Dave Anderson, who was just going out and finding stories around the South to feature that, again, is something unique. We obviously can't do video in print, but we can supplement and complement what we do in print with what we do on our website in all of these different ways, making music available on our website for people to listen to. All kinds of new content that's available at oxfordamerican.org that you can't get in the print magazine. So again, so people can continue that experience. I feel like, what we have is this sort of media landscape that's divided into several sections, where we have the internet for disposable information, the kind of information that you go to quickly, whether it's, Wikipedia, which has replaced the encyclopedia, whether it's, again, newspapers or the internet version of newspapers these days. And, as far as, kind of the readers go, the digital readers, those are definitely, I think, going to be where books head. Because, books are bulky and books are expensive, but, people can get the same experience on the readers because books are just text. So it really doesn't matter sometimes if you're looking at text on a paper or text on digital readers. I have to admit, I still read a book, and it means something to me to have it in my hands. But, I also like reading newspapers in print too, but I just feel like logic dictates that newspapers are probably news is going to end up on the internet, books are going to end up on readers, but magazines will still have a place in print. And we may be everywhere, but when I think about the future of print media, I think the future of print media will be dominated by what we know as a magazine. So with that in mind, I will be glad to answer any of your questions.